Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take your stack of source materials, your burning questions, and distill them into the essential knowledge you need with all the necessary context, prize sites.
And today, we are embarking on a truly unique mission. The sources you provided, and it's this really deep, personal, philosophical critique of modern animated media, they compel us to investigate the very soul of visual storytelling.
Yeah, this isn't about numbers.
Not at all. We're not analyzing box office returns or technical specs. We're trying to get at the emotional temperature of animation.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have this really fascinating material, and it explores the philosophical divide, traditional 2D animation and the modern ubiquity of 3D.
Especially the trend toward photorealistic remakes.
Exactly. And the core question, pulled right from your critique, so powerful. Does the evolution of animation technology, relentless march, actually enhance emotional storytelling?
Or does it, this is the core of the argument, does it paradoxically actively detract from the genuine, immediate connection that animation is supposed to foster?
It feels like the central aesthetic struggle of, the last 20 years in cinema.
I think so.
Yeah.
But we have to acknowledge a unique challenge here. The primary source material, it originated in Hebrew, and the source author themselves cautioned that when you're translating these complex, subjective concepts, these artistic feeling, words like alienating or colder,
they carry a different weight.
They carry a specific cultural and emotional weight in the original language. So we have to be careful. We have to treat this not as, a simple film review, but as a deep cultural critique of art. We have to respect that the translation might slightly dilute the intensity of the feeling being described.
That's a crucial point. So we're not just translating words, we're trying to translate a feeling. We're extracting the core artistic argument, which all centers on the felt experience of you, the viewer. So let's set the stage. It's 2D expressive magic versus 3D photorealistic fidelity. Which one truly captures the imagination? And more importantly, why do you, the listener, feel so strongly that one succeeds where the other... Okay, let's jump right into the central and, I think, pretty controversial claim. The source material suggests that a lot of recent animated films and series, especially the ones leaning hard into modern 3D or CGI realism,
they're perceived as emotionally cold or more alienating, especially when you hold them up against their traditional 2D counterparts.
And what's so interesting to me here is that this isn't a critique of one or two bad movies.
No, it's systemic. It's a critique of the medium as an emotional vehicle. It's not about the quality of the script or the voice acting. It's about the quality of the visual language itself.
So the argument is that this feeling of detachment, it isn't some kind of failure of technical artistry. I mean, the rendering on these films is usually impeccable.
Oh, it's flawless. But the source posits that the medium itself acts as a barrier. It's like it inserts this invisible wall or distance between the audience and the narrative.
And to explore this feeling of detachment, the source author actually talks about a specific conversation they had. It was a moment of personal inquiry.
Yeah, they asked someone close to them, why do I feel this deeper, more present connection in the 2D worlds I love compared to these newer 3D films? It's a question I think a lot of us have asked ourselves.
I know I have. And the answer they got back was just perfect.
It was so profound. The answer was that maybe 3D is just inherently a little colder or alienating, and that the traditional alternative 2D, it tends to express a little more emotion.
Such a simple way to put it, but it lands. That insight suggests that, for this viewer at least, the technical rendering of the world fundamentally changes how the human mind processes, connects with the characters inside it. Okay, but I have to push back just a little here. I mean, if 3D technology can render these incredibly subtle shadows, microscopic details on fur or skin, nuanced lighting, shouldn't that allow for greater subtlety and emotional expression, not less?
You'd think so.
Right. So why would the brain perceive higher fidelity as colder?
This brings us squarely into the territory of psychology and artistic tradition. It's what people sometimes call the uncanny valley effect, though maybe not the really grotesque version of it.
Okay.
When animation gets hyper-realistic, the brain starts demanding flawless biological accuracy. It's like a switch flips. In 2D, the stylized nature, the fact that it's obviously a drawing, it grants the viewer permission to accept the artifice.
The rules are different from the start.
Right. The emotional cues are exaggerated and instantly readable. A massive eye, a drooping mouth, things that aren't physically possible but are emotionally true.
But with photorealistic 3D,
The characters often lack this necessary exaggeration because they're tied to, well, realistic geometry. If a character looks 95% real, but their eyes don't move with the natural microexpressions that we subconsciously look for in a real face.
That 5% gap is huge.
It's a chasm.
Yeah.
That small imperfection registers as detachment or emotional vacancy. Even if the animators tried their best to make them look sad, our brains are just screaming, something is wrong here.
So 2D gives you the exaggerated emotional shorthand, which we read instantly, while 3D gives you what is essentially a scientific model. And when that scientific model fails to perfectly capture human microexpression, we feel alien.
The pursuit of visual truth undercuts the emotional truth.
Yeah.
Precisely. And this systemic shift, it was really catalyzed by one single event. We have to talk about the origins of the 3D trend. The source identifies one film that truly popularized 3D animation globally.
1995's Toy Story.
That's the one.
It's the flashpoint. Toy Story wasn't just a hit. The source says it created a trend or hysteria for the format. It pushed 3D from being this novel experiment to being the mainstream default. And this sets up a crucial historical paradox for the source author.
It absolutely does. Because despite their overall really strong critique against the coldness of modern 3D, the source author explicitly makes a very specific personal exception.
Which is?
They state that the only 3D films they genuinely loved and connected with were the first two Toy Story films.
First two.
The first two. The subsequent, more technically advanced versions, including the later sequels, just failed to capture that initial magic for them.
That is a fascinating and I think a highly insightful distinction to make. It forces us to analyze what made those early pioneering films successful emotionally, even though their tech was, crude compared to today.
Well, just look at the technical limitations of 1995 CGI.
Yeah.
They couldn't render complex textures easily. They couldn't model organic, complex human forms or detailed environments without enormous computing power.
So they were forced into stylization.
They were forced into caricature. Woody is geometrically simplified. Buzz is bright, shiny plastic. Their features are exaggerated and instantly readable. The very constraints of the technology dictated an aesthetic that was actually closer to 2D expression than it was to photorealistic fidelity.
So the source author's love for Toy Story 1 and 2 isn't a contradiction at all. It's basically proof of their thesis.
It is.
The early 3D succeeded because it retained the expressive exaggeration necessary for warmth, which was enforced by technical necessity. As the technology got better, let's say by Toy Story 4, and those constraints disappeared, the drive toward hyperfidelity kicked in.
And that, according to the source, is where the emotional connection.
It's a powerful thought experiment. If 3D technology had taken much longer to mature, or if the market hadn't embraced it so widely after Toy Story, the entire landscape of animation would look so different today.
Oh, completely different. The source clearly feels the industry chose the technologically flashiest path, and in doing so, sacrificed a proven emotional delivery system in 2D.
Oh, yeah.
It really compels us to ask, is this shift a real improvement? Or is it just a very expensive aesthetic choice?
Okay, let's dig deeper into the philosophical reason underpinning all this disappointment. The source author really boils down their distaste for modern 3D to one central
that it's too realistic or too authentic.
Which is where we have to confront the very definition of what animation is for. For this viewer, 3D, in its quest for reality, it strips away the essential escapism that the genre is supposed to provide.
Animation is meant to be a portal, and when the visual aesthetic gets too close to photorealism, it's like it's constantly tugging the viewer back into the real world. It disrupts that necessary immersive fantasy you need for emotional buy-in.
And they use their own viewing habits as the primary evidence for this. They note that they are still watching beloved animated series today well past their 20s, precisely because the escapist quality and the narratives in the traditional 2D format are strong enough to hold their...
They make the argument that a story done well in 2D with, sufficient quality in its execution can captivate the viewer for a monumental length of time. I think they use the phrase a million years.
Million years, yeah.
And that longevity is rooted in the fact that 2D, by being so overtly an artifice, it allows for a more complete suspension of disbelief. The rules of reality are clearly broken from the get-go, so the viewer doesn't feel compelled to check their engagement against the real world.
But wait, isn't there a genuine artistic achievement in rendering something that looks real but is... If the goal is immersion, shouldn't realism actually help with that?
That's the exact paradox the source author highlights.
Yeah.
They acknowledge that the only positive quality they see in many modern 3D film is that the characters look very authentic. But that authenticity, that technical achievement, is precisely what prevents them from loving the works completely. It creates this kind of cognitive friction. The brain registers the visual input as being too real, but the narrative and the action are pure fantasy.
And that leads to that feeling of alienation we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. The realism becomes a distraction. We're so busy noting how good the fur looks on a character or how accurate the lighting is bouncing off a surface that we forget to connect with the character's actual plight.
This leads them to a really effective analogy. They describe modern 3D as this uncomfortable blend, half cartoon, half realistic.
Yeah, they liken it to a film like Mary Poppins, but they're specifically criticizing the hybrid nature where the animated element looks too real relative to the established genre code.
That analogy is brilliant, but we should break it down a bit more. In Mary Poppins, see the animated, and it's clearly a stylized, fits seamlessly into that fantastic operating on a different, openly artificial visual.
Exactly. When a 3D character pushes toward photorealism, it tries to occupy the same visual plane as the real world, rather than defining its own. It sits in that uncomfortable half state.
So if the whole goal is to create something visually unreal that feels emotionally real,
then making the characters physically authentic actually undermines the artistic distance you need. When the fantasy is visually grounded in our reality, the viewer is subconsciously looking for the limits of that fantasy rather than just submitting to it entirely.
it's about the permission structure of art. A traditional 2D drawing tells you immediately, I am a drawing, treat me as pure imagination.
Right.
Whereas a photorealistic CGI creature says, I am a realistic representation of life. Now please critique my fidelity to physics. That high fidelity changes the way we engage. It makes us critics of reality rather than participants in fantasy.
It raises a really powerful critical challenge for you, the listener. How does high-fidelity animation impact the necessary suspension of disbelief? I mean, when an animator is forced to obey physics and biology to create authenticity, they lose the artistic freedom to exaggerate and distort.
And distortion is often the most direct, the most visceral route to emotional expression in animation.
It is. So if you prioritize realism over that expressive distortion, you risk a sterile final product.
It sounds like the difference between seeing a classical statue, which idealizes human form and emotion, and maybe a 3D scan of a live model, which captures every single flaw but lacks that interpretive.
That's a perfect way to describe it. The source is arguing that animation should always lean toward the idealization and expression, not the scan. And that aesthetic choice realism over expression is what this entire source material is fundamentally arguing against as a governing philosophy for the industry.
Okay, so if that was the philosophy, this section is the smoking gun. We are turning to the most specific, concrete critique leveled against photorealistic 3D remake. The failure of emotional expression in the 2019 version of The Lion. The source author felt this remake was, and I'm using their exact words, not as the 1990s.
This specific case study is the perfect illustration of how realism can actively inhibit expression. The original Lion King is cited by the source as one of Disney's most iconic and successful films ever, which makes the choice to remake it so fraught with danger.
And the magic of the original was so intrinsically tied to the expressiveness of the 2D characters, right? I mean, Simba's huge, tragic eyes, Scar's malicious sneer.
You couldn't get that any other way. And the detailed analysis of the complaint in the source is just devastating. The source notes a huge difference, not just because the characters look more real, but because they fundamentally lack faces.
They lack facial expressions.
They lack facial expressions. The realism stripped them of their visual soul.
And the problem lies in the biological constraints of photorealism, right?
That's it. When you render a lion to look exactly like a real lion, you inherit its biological limitation. And real lions, because of their facial musculature, they simply cannot convey the complex, nuanced human emotion, like subtle sorrow, manipulative glee, or existential heartbreak that were absolutely essential to the original film's drama.
The 2D artists, they gave the lions human eyebrows and flexible mouths. The 2019 version had to stick to rigid, realistic lion.
Think about the iconic moment. Scar's villainy, for example. In the original, he's a Shakespearean villain. It's expressed through these highly stylized, angular features, a perpetual sneer, and these piercing, human-like eyes.
In the 2019 version, what does he have? His facial repertoire is limited to what a real lion can twitch, snarl.
Right. And the source notes that this lack of expressive range, which stems purely from the visual style, it effectively drained the film of meaning.
Let's talk about the scene of Mufasa's death.
Yeah. In 2D, young Simba's face is a canvas of pure, cartoonish devastation. Massive welling tears, a collapsed posture. His eyes convey the sheer depth of his loss. The camera holds on that expression, making the tragedy instantly legible to a 5-year-old.
In the 2019 version, a realistic tub can only manage, what, a wide-eyed stare? Maybe a whine?
The visual communication of immense grief is just lost in translation.
It feels like the filmmakers just assumed the audience would project the emotion onto the realistic creature, based on the content.
Right, they expected us to do the work.
But the character itself offered no visual invitation for that action.
That's the crux of it. 2D is inherently empathetic because the expressions are forced and immediate. The hyper-realistic version requires the audience to do all the emotional heavy lifting. The animators in the original were masters of necessary exaggeration.
They drew anthropomorphic eyes and brows onto a lion because emotional legibility is paramount to drama.
And when you inhibit this necessary exaggeration by chasing photorealism, you achieve visual authenticity, but you completely sacrifice emotional authenticity.
The source author isn't completely closed off to the technology. There's a hopeful sentiment.
There is, yeah. They express a hope that if technology improves enough, future realistic 3D will find some solution for conveying these human-like facial expressions on animal or other
So they recognize that maybe the current technology just isn't advanced enough to bridge that gap between biological accurate emotion.
It's an important. They're basically saying, don't stop trying to advance 3D, but please stop compromising the emotional core. And the disappointment over The Lion King was so palpable that the source author expresses this fervent hope that the filmmakers don't ruin a potential.
Or just stop making these kinds of remakes entirely until the expression issue is genuinely solved.
Exactly. The powerful critique of the modern studio system, where the technical achievement of rendering realistic fur and water often gets prioritized over the communication of a character's internal state.
So the source author is essentially issuing a demand. 3D animators have to figure out how to be warm and emotional, or they should defer to 2D drawing when the story requires that complex, immediate emotional connection.
Because the failure isn't technical, it's philosophical. The source material reminds us that the fundamental job of animation is to make us feel, not just to make us marvel at realism. And the path to feeling, it argues, is often through the expressive power of the impossible, not the accurate poly.
Okay, moving beyond just Disney remakes, the source material delivers a really broad critique against the whole trend of taking beloved intellectual property IP and changing its fundamental style.
Yeah, often switching a highly expressive 2D series to a realistic 3D or a live-action form.
This feels like a deep critique of, brand management and artistic
It is. The source highlights a perceived pattern. Realistic versions of cherished animated series. And they specifically call out adaptation, like the live-action attempt at Winx, the Fairy series.
Oh, that was rough.
And the multiple attempts to adapt Dragon Ball Z, they often fail commercially and critically for this exact reason. They abandon the original 2D aesthetic that gave the work its character and its emotional resonance.
I mean, the visual styles of Dragon Ball Z or the original Winx were inherently fantastical. They relied on exaggerated physics, vibrant colors, impossible expressions.
And when you try to translate those extreme characteristics into the real world, or even hyper-realistic CGI, the source suggests the magic is just. It's inevitably lost.
This leads the source author to express specific anxiety over future adaptation. They're hoping that the upcoming Avatar, The Last Airbender, doesn't fall into the same trap as the failed Winx and Dragon Ball adapts.
And that constant anxiety over IP corruption is, I think, a defining feature of being a modern fan. You're always worried about the thing you love.
Let's elaborate on the deeper damage here, because the argument against changing animation styles entirely is firm. The source author strongly opposes replacing a drawn series with a realist, but the critique is that this doesn't just result in a bad new product.
No, the feeling is that making a new, inferior version ruins the old ones.
And this is such a sophisticated point about cultural memory. I mean, how can a new film ruin the old one if the original is still available on a shelf or a streaming platform?
Right, you can still watch it. But the source material notes that even though the original still exists, the bad new versions ruin the old ones by damaging the shared positive emotional history associated with that IP.
It's like it taints the memory.
Exactly. A successful piece of art creates this positive cultural touchstone. A failed, inauthentic adaptation comes along and replaces that pure, positive memory with a subsequent negative association.
It's the cheapening of the legacy. So if the original Dragon Ball Z was a memory of pure kinetic energy and expressive artwork, the disappointing live-action movie becomes this new, ugly footnote, and it alters the way the IP is discussed or remembered in the collective conscious.
The original art becomes tainted by the subsequent failure, and this leads directly to the philosophical conclusion reached by the source author, which is a powerful ethical statement about creative control.
They paraphrase that popular saying, just because you have the right to produce these, it doesn't mean you have to.
That's the just because you can argument. It's a forceful plea for restraint in the face of limitless IP leverage. It argues that corporate ownership does not automatically grant artistic justification.
Especially when the resulting product diminishes the emotional investment that fans have made over decades.
And the source author provides a clear pathway for expansion that doesn't involve this destructive remaking cycle. They argue that if studios absolutely must revisit beloved world, like the Avatar world, for example, they should do so with entirely new characters, completely unconnected to the original cast.
So you expand the universe laterally and you respect the emotional anchors that are already established.
Yes. The source author argues vehemently against changing core, established figures like Woody, Buzz, or Jessie from Toy Story into hyper-realistic live-action or CGI. Doing that, they argue, fundamentally destroys the perception of the character that's been established over years of connection.
We have an emotional contract with the 2D Woody. Turning him into a photorealistic puppet just breaks that contract.
And they contrast this failure mode with a successful model, the continuation of Naruto into Boruto.
Oh, that's a great example.
It is. While Boruto still features the old characters, the core focus shifts entirely to the new generation and new conflict. This narrative evolution, rather than a stylistic remake, makes the transition acceptable.
Because the original characters remain mostly untouched by the corrosive nature of the adaptation, it offers a pathway for expansion that actually respects.
So the lesson here is, if you want to use the IP, create new heroes for the new medium. Don't try to use the new medium to remake the old hero. That way, if the new thing fails, the original magic remains intact. The source author is just deeply committed to protecting the integrity of established character design and the positive memory associated with these foundational stories.
Okay, so given this intense step toward pure photorealistic 3D, the natural question is whether there's a middle ground. Is there a place where 3D exist or blend?
The source material does explore this possibility. They mention a series that attempts a blend, The Dragon Prince.
Right, and The Dragon Prince is a great example to discuss because it uses 3D models, but it tries to stylize to mimic the aesthetic.
It often incorporates reduced frame rates to give the action a more classic drawn or stylized feel, but the source author notes this blend didn't work for them personally.
And I think I know why. For a lot of viewers, that particular blend, with its reduced frame rate, it can result in this stuttering or choppy movement that just emphasizes the artifice in a visually
Yeah, it doesn't feel like 2D. It feels like 3D struggling to imitate 2D. The sense of an uncomfortable mix persists, which kind of proves that stylistic mimicry isn't the same as genuine emotional warmth.
But they do find one successful hybrid example, and it offers a genuine pathway forward.
They do, and it's this deep-cut reference to Beyblade Metal Fusion. This is key, because it shows a strategic use of the technology.
Let's analyze this successful because it's pretty clever. The source describes Beyblade Metal Fusion as using traditional 2D for the characters, so it maintains the classic expressive viewer wants.
Right. But the Beyblades themselves, the spinning tops that are central to the act, were rendered in 3D.
And this worked brilliantly. It utilized 3D where it excels for inanimate objects that require realistic, complex rotation, weight, and detailed movement in space.
3D modeling is perfect for machinery and objects that need kinetic energy illustrated consistently. By keeping the emotional core, the character's face and body, in 2D, the show retained its warmth while using 3D strategically to enhance the action sequence.
So the solution is treating 3D as a sophisticated special effects tool rather than the primary vehicle for character.
Exactly.
If 3D is used for environments or crops or, spinning tops, it maintains the magic while embracing new technological possibilities.
It's about letting the technology serve the art, rather than allowing the technology to dictate the art. The source author's critique is not anti-technology, it is pro-emotion. They believe technology should facilitate stronger storytelling, not stand in the way of audience connection.
This brings us back to the historical foundation of 3D. The source author points out the instrumental role of Steve Jobs, the former CEO of Apple, in the creation and popularization of 3D animation through his work with Pixar.
Right.
And the source expresses deep doubt that Jobs would be happy with the state of current 3D film.
The implication there is that Jobs, despite championing the technical leap to 3D, valued above all else the integrity of strong narratives and emotional depth, which is what defined those early Pixar films.
He was a storyteller first.
Absolute. The source author believes that even with the immense technological leaps we've seen, Jobs would be disappointed in current 3D, particularly its focus on hyper-realism at the expense of genuine emotional storytelling and robust plot.
It's an appeal to the foundational spirit of innovation, the idea that the technology was meant to enable better stories, not just prettier, more accurate picture. Technical prowess should be in service of the emotional experience.
And this leads to the final, passionate call to action from the source material. The overwhelming hope, the non-negotiable, is that animators and producers must never stop making 2D hand-drawn films and series.
They cite timeless examples like the original Lion King and Hayao Miyazaki's Japanese mass Spirited Away,
emphasizing that drawing should continue in depth regardless of 3D development.
It's really a defense of drawing as an art form that is essential to human connect. The ultimate plea is for technology to be developed that is warm and emotional enough to truly allow for audience.
To ensure that 3D is not a technology that actively gets in the way of genuine emotional storytelling. Until 3D can consistently capture that inherent human warmth and expressive exaggeration, the source author argues, 2D remains the superior emotional medium. The freedom of the drawn line transcends the limitations of realism, and that freedom is what the viewer connects with most profound.
We took a true deep dive into a powerful, culturally nuanced critique that views the evolution of anime from the expressive freedom of 2D to the technical constraints of photorealistic 3D through the essential lens of emotional connection, identity, and the corrosion of nostalgia.
And the analysis underscores a major philosophical debate in modern visual media. Does pushing for high technical realism in animation necessarily come at the cost of emotional resonance and character expression? The sources you provided strongly suggest that, for many discerning viewers, the answer is a resounding yes.
It's like the technical fidelity of 3D creates an artistic dis.
It does. It confirms that the simplicity, the stylization, and the necessary exaggeration of 2D still hold an unparalleled and deeply personal magic.
So it seems like we've learned that the most advanced technology is often not the best artistic choice, especially when you're dealing with fantasy, memory, and raw, immediate.
Right. The source argues that animation must always prioritize escapism, and the moment a technology pulls the viewer back into a sense of the real world, it fundamentally fails its mission. The argument is not against progress, but against the replacement of a proven emotional language with a shiny but ultimately cold technical achievement.
It forces us to distinguish between what looks accurate and what. So we leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, one that builds directly on the source author.
Think about the beloved characters you grew up. What specific artistic choice, a specific way a tear was drawn, the exaggeration of an eyebrow, the impossibility of a silhouette, what would be impossible to replicate without losing its immediate emotional power in a photorealistic 3D environment?
What truly defines that essential cartoon magic for you, and how much of it is tied to the fact that it's fundamentally impossible?
Consider that the source author feels that the failure of modern 3D is a failure of warmth. If you could give one piece of advice to a studio attempting to use photorealistic CGI for a beloved character, how would you instruct them to prioritize emotional capture over visual accuracy?
See you next time for